I think we must recognize that if we were following the church year in the manner in which we should have been following it, that this Sunday we would be doing what we did last Sunday, that of looking at the portion of the Apostles' Creed which affirmed that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. For this, within the church year, is designated as Passion Sunday, the time when we remember our Lord's suffering. However, today we look at another part of the Apostles' Creed as we continue looking at sections of it. That section which affirms that Jesus shall come again, return, to judge the quick and the dead, to judge the living and the dead. From thence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead. I think we should be aware that probably there are many persons within the church who have no idea of what we're talking about when we talk about the traditional belief which the church has had that there will be a second coming, that Christ will return, and at that time there will be a judgment between those who are good and those who are bad, those who are righteous and those who are unrighteous. I'm sure that many people are unaware of what the church many times in the past and many times even in the present has taught, has continued to teach concerning this second coming. Jonathan Edwards, one of the leading New England preachers of a century and a half, 2 centuries ago, used to delight in describing to his congregation how God on that day would pick us up and dangle us over the pits of hell, letting the fiery flames lick at our flesh, much the same way that we would take an insect and hold it over a candle, the loathsome creature, so angry with him, so despiteful of him, so hateful of him, that we would just want to get rid of him and punish him in this manner. Well, fortunately, by and large, we don't hear such teachings presented today. Fortunately, people today are no longer obsessed with the idea of what will happen on that day, no longer obsessed with the idea that there is a hell with eternally burning flames and that some persons may very well end up there eternally burning for whatever purpose God may have in mind. Fortunately, we today are no longer obsessed with these things, and in our Christianity we are more concerned about living today, about life today. And we either respond to Christianity or we fail to respond to Christianity, depending upon whether or not it has some relevance for us as we live our lives today. As I look at Christianity, all that I have to judge with are the experiences which I have had, the limited knowledge which I have of God, which matches up, which seems true according to what I have experienced, according to my best judgments. And there are certain things that I have come to feel about God, that personally I have come to feel about God. Personally, I have a hard time understanding how Jesus, how Christ, and how God in Christ would be able to say to those people who are nailing him on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Hard time understanding how that God could, on the other hand, condemn a person to burn eternally in hell simply for not giving him a drink of water. It's rather impossible for me to believe that the same Christ, the same God in Christ, could do one and also do the other. Also, I have a hard time visualizing, really thinking that it's going to happen, that someday, on that day, God's going to say, "Gabriel, bring me the file on Mr. Smith," and then go down the list and check off what is good and what is bad in that file. I also have a hard time feeling that finally any discrimination, any division can be made between the damned and the saved, the damned and the blessed. Judging from what I see in my own life and the sin which is present in my own life, I have the feeling that in some sense all of us are sinners. all of us are sinners. Well, as I say, fortunately today we don't hear much about these flames of hell, about this judgment which is going to take place, this division which the church traditionally has taught. And yet I would hesitate to throw this traditional belief of the church out the window so easily. I am enough of a conservative, at least in some things, to feel that we had better look pretty seriously at something which the church has held as important for so many centuries. And so, I would say today, let us take a look at this traditional belief of the church that at some time in the future, on that day, Christ will return and that he'll judge both the dead and the living. Let us look at this belief and see what relevance it may have for us as we live our lives today, and how we can come to understand this traditional belief so that it has some relevance for us. I would be quick to add, however, something which I added at other times in sermons, attempt to make it clear how I regard a sermon. I regard a sermon not as the last word on a subject, but rather I regard a sermon as words which hopefully will lead to other words, to other thoughts, to other discussions. I regard a sermon as simply my feeling resulting from the best knowledge that I have, the best research I can come up with at this point in my life, the way that I see it at this point. And it may very well not be the way that you see it. And I would not judge who is right and who is wrong. So with this understanding of what a sermon is, at least in my eyes, and with this understanding that let's search and see what this traditional belief of the church may have to say to us as we live our lives, let us proceed. I think that one of the things which this belief says to us, and one of the things which I find true, which I become convinced of out of my own experiences, is that God's purposes will ultimately triumph. God's purposes for his world and for his people will ultimately triumph. You know, the Judeo-Christian view of history is much different from some other views of history. We regard history as moving in a line toward a goal, toward a purpose, toward some final goal out there. We're moving toward something. Other views of history, particularly the Greek view, more is that history is moving in a circle. That we just keep repeating the same things over and over again. In contrast to that view, the Christian view, the Judeo-Christian view, is that we are moving toward a goal. Well, the basic affirmation then, which we make, is that God did not create the world and people and then go off and leave it for it to wander about wherever it might go, but the affirmation that God is still present in his world and will remain in his world, bringing things to that final goal, bringing about to fulfillment, to accomplishment, all that he intended for his world and for his creatures to be. The affirmation that not only should God reign in the world, but the affirmation that he will reign, that he will be triumphant. And all that is contrary to his purpose, all that is contrary to his will fall away as rubbish, will be defeated. All disease, all war, all hatred, all hunger, all brutality, all selfish ambition will fall away. It is doomed. God and his purposes will be triumphant. Now, I think this is something of the basic resurrection faith which we have. But really what we are affirming in the resurrection faith is that Jesus is triumphant over death. And this is simply an extension of our resurrection faith, the affirmation that Jesus is triumphant over all that is contrary to his purpose and to his will. And thus, as Christians, we're able to view history, we're able to view the present from the perspective of the end. One biographer said that when you're writing the story of a person's life, the beginning point is not his birth, but rather the beginning point is his death. That you have to look at everything else in his life in light of the end. And likewise, in Christianity, in the world, in the history which we participate, as Christians we are privileged to look at things from the perspective of the end. The end being that God is triumphant over all evil. God is triumphant over all that is contrary to him and to his purposes. And this certainly doesn't lessen the tragedy and the suffering of what we are engaged in day by day. Not in the least. But rather we live our lives with the unshakable faith that all that is contrary to the will of God, all that is contrary to his purposes, is only temporal, is only passing, and will pass away. You see, I think that this basic faith which Martin Luther expressed in that great hymn, A Mighty Fortress, when he said, "And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed his truth to triumph through us." This basic affirmation, this basic faith which we have as Christians is powerful stuff, where it makes a tremendous difference in how we're able to live our lives. We're able to live with an optimism, not a false optimism, but a basic optimism that we're moving towards something which is worthwhile and that it will succeed, contrary to a pessimism that sees only defeat and failure, things going downhill out ahead. You see, this basic faith makes it possible for us to work, knowing that what we may very well be able to carry out only partially in our lives, in our work, will be carried to completion by God, will reach a fulfillment, will reach a completion. It makes the difference between being able to live meaningful lives and lives simply of resignation. It makes the difference between being able to live with hope and being able to live only with defeat. In faith, we have the knowledge of a Lord of history who will perfect his work. The knowledge, the faith that God did not create his world and then desert it, but that he created it with a purpose, a goal in mind, and that ultimately his goal and his purpose will be triumphant in the world. Now, part of this goal which God has for his world, part of this goal, I think, is that all creatures should be in communion with him. All creatures should have a close relationship with him. All creatures should be his sons, as he intended them to be. Again, a basic personal belief which I have, which may or may not be orthodox, but the basic belief that in the eyes of God, no life is dispensable. No life can simply be thrown away. That for a person ultimately to be separated from God would be defeat for God. That person was created as his son, and it is God's intention that he should become his son, become who he is. And so I have a hard time visualizing this God simply throwing someone into eternal fires to burn eternally. But rather, this being defeat for God, and God not going to be defeated. God's intention is that that person become the son he was intended to be. You see, the Old Testament God was not a vindictive God who simply inflicted punishment upon his people for the sake of punishment, but rather the Old Testament God was one who continually carried his people in such paths that would lead them back to him. He would carry them into exile when they would begin to forsake him, so that in exile they could come to learn their great dependence upon him and return to him. The Old Testament God was not a vindictive God, but rather the Old Testament God was one who led his people in such ways that they would turn again and worship him and realize that they were his people. And I think that the New Testament God is no less a loving God. Jesus describes that day as a time when there'll be a great feast, and God will want people to come and sit at his table. And he'll want people there so badly that he'll even go out into the streets and bring them in to sit around his table and share his joy with him. Or Jesus describes this God in terms of the waiting father, the parable of the prodigal son, the father who is pained every hour that this son is separated from him. Not a God who simply closes the door, the person down, but rather a God who feels an intense pain, an intense longing, as long as his son is separated from him, and a God who welcomes this son back eventually in the end. Well, I think that this God whom Jesus describes to us in these ways will not alter and become a different God at some time in the future. Well, some people may say, well, okay, if that's the way you look at it, then there'll just be a great whitewash. Everything will be considered to be okay. There's no judgment. What difference does everything make then? Well, let us look at Zacchaeus. You know, Jesus, when he was with Zacchaeus, was not some pompous judge who passed judgment upon Zacchaeus, but neither was this a whitewash. But rather there was judgment in that situation when Jesus was present with Zacchaeus. But the judgment came as Zacchaeus looked at himself, comparing himself to Jesus, comparing who he was in relation to who he was intended to be. Tremendous, painful judgment as Zacchaeus looked at this. There was judgment. Zacchaeus was judging himself as he looked at Jesus. This is the way that it has to be. Recall the woman caught in adultery brought to Jesus. Again, Jesus does not judge her, but there is judgment in the situation. The woman judges herself as she looks at herself and who she has been being in relation to who she was created to be, who she was intended to be. A painful situation, a painful thing to look at ourselves in light of who we were intended to be. I think that probably this is all the hell that we will need. All the hell we will need simply to have to stand in the light and look at ourselves as we are. You know, there are moments in this life when we come to realize something about ourselves which we really don't like. And this is a painful thing, to have to look at this part of our lives. And how much more painful to stand face to face with reality, face to face with the light, and have to look at our lives and the shoddiness, the shortcomings of our lives in relation to what they should have been, what they were intended to be. Painful. There are in some ways, that truth and fire are synonymous. Truth and fire, synonymous. Well, I really cannot say that as a result of all this that I believe in some type of purgatory. I wouldn't be caught in that position, and yet there are several basic affirmations which I do find at this point. First, that God is love and that his power is directed by his love. Not his love directed by his power, but his power is directed by his love. And that God is not at peace and will not be at peace until all of his sons are united with him. That he will be the waiting father, and that obliteration or annihilation of the rebellious will not be triumph for him, but will be defeat, will not be victory, but will be tragedy. And I know as I look at my own life and my own heart, I know that it may take a little while as I stand face to face with reality before I am able to look fully at all that I really am. It may take a while for all to be burned away, which needs to be burned away. It may take a while for me to be able to go through all of this suffering and pain which I will have to go through as I examine my own life and my own sinfulness, my own evil, as I stand before reality, as I stand before God himself. And so, surely this is God's plan for all people to be united with him. And surely he will not stop short of this goal, this purpose. And so it seems that our lives in the present then become very important. And this belief has some relevance to our lives in the present For this means that the present, then, is the time when we are attempting to move closer to that which we were created to be. You see, if love is the thing, and if finally love is going to rule, this means then that I'd better today start getting rid of all the hate that I have. I might as well begin to get in tune with reality. I might as well begin getting my heart in tune with the heart of God. In thinking about this, I could not help but recall the story which I've told before. Talking with the man on the streets of Pretoria one day when he said that God intended in this world for the blacks and whites to be separated, but that in the world to come, the blacks and whites would be together, one big happy family. And our replying to him that if he was uncomfortable with the blacks in this world, that we felt that probably heaven, that he would be very uncomfortable in heaven. You see, the world today, the situation that we're in today, is the place where we began working to be comfortable with that which ultimately will be our situation. We work today to be comfortable in the presence of reality, to be comfortable in the presence of Christ, in the presence of God. Unless we begin to feel self-righteous as we think of ourselves as much better in relation to that man on the streets of Pretoria, unless we begin to feel self-righteous, let us look at our own hearts, our own petty hatreds, our own prejudices, our own self-centeredness, the times when we are motivated not out of love, but out of simply what others are thinking. You see, along with this goes the basic belief also that reality does not change. Whatever reality may be, whatever God may be, that does not change. And I don't know exactly what reality is or exactly what God and what all of his purposes, all of his wills are for the world. I don't claim to know this, certainly. But I know enough of reality, I know enough about God to recognize that there is much in my own life that falls short. The purpose of creation, then, for all people to have a close, vital relationship with the Creator, to be in communion with God, the purpose of life, the time for working toward being comfortable in the presence of God, and the knowledge that God and his ultimate purpose for his creatures will not be defeated. From thence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead. The assurance that his purposes will triumph, the reminder that what I truly am will one day be revealed. The relevance for living life today, the assurance that we can work for good with the assurance that the good for which we work will ultimately triumph. And the reminder that today is the day when we mold our lives to be in line with the purposes of God, when we tune our hearts so that they will be more closely in tune with the heart of God.